China can avoid the I guess the lure of empire, because like not go down the same path as America, because political realists, we often tend to see that power will impact intentions. That is, if again, as you and I have spoken about before, my my favorite political economist would be Friedrich List, who in the first half of the 19th century made the point that he made a big difference between the British and the Americans. He said the British were able to build an empire essentially standing on three legs. That is, they began to dominate the technology and industry. The second was, they then controlled all of the world's oceans. That is the physical connectivity of the world. And last was the financial connectivity. It had the main banks' currency being used. And Friedrich List was making the point that with the American system in the early 19th century, the United States, it had a completely different system. I mean, it stood on the same three legs, but it would pursue freedom and sovereignty. So he contrasted it with the British. So he said, the Americans were, pursuing their manufacturing base. They were developing the ports and the roads. They were developing a national bank. So this would be the sovereignty, the anti-hegemonic force, essentially. And when you read it today, the reason I ask is it sounds a bit like the way we often talk about China. But by 1898, you could put a date on it almost, when the Americans won the war against the Spaniards. You saw then that they acquired all these colonial possessions, and suddenly controlling the Pacific was an objective. Suddenly they had to dominate foreign markets, and this meant also territorial acquisitions, and again, all of the same three legs which had been for anti-hegemony gradually became instruments of hegemony, especially after World War II, when the US had to control all the seas, dominate the tech industries, and of course monopolize on the world currencies and development banks. So at this point in time, the US had been a complete copy, in my opinion, of the British Empire. So the reason I ask now is because China, we see it also pursuing this, I would argue, the same three legs of the American system and the British before them. That is, it has that first leg, the industrial and technological leadership. It has the connecting the world with the Belt and Road Initiative, and the last leg, of course, the financial aspect. It develops the national banks, currency, payment systems, and again, if it's anti-hegemonic, but if the distribution of power impacts intentions, well, what happens after hegemony? Because the examples you gave with clean break and the Wolfowitz doctrine, it's not an accident that they popped up in the 1990s, immediately after the Soviet Union was gone, which was the balance. So again, when America's unbalanced, then suddenly all these ideas of dominating the world for the benefit of all of humanity, for some reason, all of this, it sounds like a joke today, but in the 90s, this is what most people subscribed to. That was before they called for destroying entire civilization and, backing all these genocides. But I guess, my question, how do you see what gives you optimism about China's ability to resist this, the appeal of empire? Because, the Mersheimer's argument would be that this will be the ultimate security. If you dominate the world, you're completely safe. As you suggest, of course, it does. Empire corrupts, as you say. If you're empire abroad, good governance at home is a dream. It's gonna fall apart. So it is. I don't think empire is a good path for China, but it has a big appeal to it. So again, very long question. How can China essentially resist this?
Okay, I think it's absolutely topical. And the funny thing about it is I moved to China in 2005 because I said, well, if there's a renaissance in my lifetime, it'll be here. I have not been disappointed. But I also had the opportunity. I was chairman of my state's International Trade Council, and I had the chance to meet some fairly high people in the government. And the one thing I said to him, I said, well, you seem to be on the right track in terms of your economics and things like that. Your system is different, but it seems to suit you. There are rough edges and things like that. But I do see China rising. And this is in 2006, 7, 8, that type of period. But I said, I hope you'll study history to the extent of, and not because it's not just Great Britain. You go back over all of these empires, it was always the same. They started out, with trade, and then all of a sudden they became forced to get trade, and then, then of course it becomes justifying it with either God or gold or whatever it comes to hand. I said, I hope you don't become like us. Now, there's a couple of things about China which are noteworthy. First off, as I said, we're driven by nostalgia. You would think that China is in part driven because they said, this rejuvenation, this idea that we want to reinvigorate our economy. But that's not nostalgia necessarily. What it means is it's the recognition that we have to do new things in order to advance. And it's all about history. So, for instance, if I talk to somebody in the government at a fairly high level, they are classically trained in the sense that they know all the poets, they know the literature, their history. They are continually going to what they call the party school. They have to take courses there, mandatory every year. And as part of that, they are taught about, their history. It's, of course, it's the interpretation that they put on it, but they do learn about China's. They are not only learn, but they're fully cognizant of the power of history, especially as you get into higher levels. And they use that as a guide to the future. For instance, in dealing with Donald Trump, they understand he's transactional. They thought long and hard about how to handle him, and they found examples of people like him in their history. And that makes them a little bit unique because the more, as a history professor, you're less likely to repeat the mistakes of history if you actually study it and learn from it. So I think they continue to learn from that. And as long as they're willing to teach that, and that is central to their understanding of the world, I think they'll do well. Second, they don't push ideology. We do. And part of it is we push the ideology because it's a way, it's a defensive nature. Why have we done all these terrible things? Well, we're actually doing it for the right reason, as you pointed out, for the greater good. All right. We, every omelet, you have to break eggs. So, if you want an omelet, you have to be willing to do what's necessary. But I think that has become hollow. But China doesn't do that. They don't say you should follow our example. They say, sure, if you think we have something to offer from the way that we have developed, and so it works in your country, feel free. We don't have any intellectual property claims on it. You do what is necessary. But their idea about sovereignty is that every country, because it's a complex mosaic of cultures, history, different people, often different languages, that has to have its own path. It's not a cookie cutter. This is not one size fits all. So that is a little bit different. If you're not looking to push your ideology on people, and that means that you don't, you have no reason to run in there with your warships and beat them bloody so that they do the right thing. And the last part is China's system so far has a professional class of bureaucrats that lead up to leadership. Now, I'm not a big fan of bureaucracies, um, and they need to be watched very carefully. But those who come through the bureaucracy, as I said, you start when you're 22 to 24, and then by 54, it's going to be decided whether you continue or whether, basically you retire. And on the way up, it's brutal. It's a pyramid. You start out with millions and you end up with, one and then seven and then 25, etc. So there's not a lot of room at the top. That means that those who come up are generally extremely capable, but in any kind of system, you have to acknowledge the stronger the leader, the weaker the government. And I don't mean that in their things. It's just that new ideas find it harder to express themselves when you have a very strong and dominant government. And these are things that the Chinese government is well aware of, and also transition and all of these things. So they're thinking about these things. They're not putting their head in the sand and saying it'll go away. No, this is the natural way of things. This is a long-winded way of saying that China has a system that, on average, produces better people who are more interested in serving the people than most of the nations that I know of. And, and I want you to think about that. How does America prepare its leaders? You could be unemployed, unemployable, and you run for dog catcher, and then you run for mayor, and then you run for the Senate, and then you're president. And it sounds like a great story. And you obviously had Clinton, who rose from very humble beginnings to be president of the United States. It sounds great, the Horatio Alger story, but were they really prepared? In Clinton's case, better prepared than most because he had been a governor. But Obama, despite the fact that I think he's a very moral, a very good guy, great speaker, never really ran anything before he became president, and that became a problem for him. He was not prepared to be president. The irony is he'd be a great president today because he has the experience, right? And he understands how the bureaucracy works and how it kind of befuddled him, especially on the military matters. When you're sitting there in the Oval Office every day and the people with big stars on their chest and, lots of degrees, these are very smart people come in and they basically brainwash you over a period of time about the security threats of facing America. And you believe them because you don't have an independent sense of reference, especially somebody who was, an organizer and then, state senator and then moved up to U.S. Congress and then became president. Meteoric rise, but that didn't necessarily prepare him for that, the most complex, position in America. Whereas in China, if you're going to reach that position, you have been through the ringer many, many, many times. You know exactly how China works. You know how its systems work. You know the limits and benefits of the bureaucracy and things like that. And because it's a system where, contrary to things, Xi Jinping isn't going to nominate everybody who's going to be in power in the future. It is a collective decision-making process, and it's very complex, and there is a lobbying amongst the people there. But you cannot be a jerk and be elevated because no one likes you if you're a jerk. So, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but I mean, Ted Cruz. I mean, everybody who's ever met Ted Cruz dislikes him. They say, "Oh, yeah, he's a smart guy," but he's just not very likable. In China, there's no way he would ever been at the situation he's in. A, because he doesn't have the experience really to do what he's doing. He's not well informed, as we saw with his interview with Tucker Carlson. Didn't know how there's 2 million people in Iran. He just says, "Let's attack it." I'm the senator for Israel. Things like that. Think I can't even imagine somebody in China saying even one-tenth of the things he's saying and being in any position of power. So they have a different system. There are limits to it. But at the same time, there's always that constant warning, and that's the things. The power of human nature and what I see sometimes today, not in the top end, but in the middle end, I see these people who had nothing to do with China's successes. I mean, in the hard parts and going through, the Cultural Revolution, things like that. They somehow take on the mantle of China's successes, and they try to take it very personally, and they become, in many cases, very hawkish, saying, "We need to teach everybody a lesson. We're strong. You know who. You have to know who China is." And that kind of talk worries me. But as I said, the people at the top who continually go up do not generally reflect these views. They tend to be, as I said, very historically based. They're very certain that a good future does not involve conflict. As China continues to try to tamp down all the nonsense that's going on in the world, started by other nations. So, yeah, I do think there's that constant danger, and if you ignore it, then you're really in trouble. You can't do that. We see across Europe, alternative for Deutschland, to FD. You see the right-wing parties, who are in essence have fascistic tendencies, rising on populist programs and things like that. Are their leaders capable of governing? Have they ever done any governing? No. They'll make promises to get into power, but they will have no idea how to keep them. And you can see that with Milei in Argentina. You can see that across the board, including Donald Trump. He has no idea how to follow through on all the promises he's made. In fact, he's now at the position where he is actually going in the opposite direction of everything he's promised. Healthcare is more expensive. The prices are up. Gasoline is up. Forever wars continue to go on. And he's paying no attention to bringing real jobs back to America. That whole thing has failed. So, yeah, that's the danger there, but then, how does China react to that? Do they think, "Oh, we're superior?" I think adopting an air of superiority is the greatest weakness. I know very few people who are truly confident who act superior. And I mean that. People who are trying to convince you they're superior, I always suspect, have self-worth issues that they're trying to cover up their inadequacies by convincing you that they're strong. If you're truly strong, you rely on your arguments, you get examples, you do things, you don't talk about as much. So I do think Chinese have a much longer shelf life in terms of how they deal with things. But the future is unknown, and as I said, it's a continual battle. The only thing we know for certain is there's going to be more change, and when those changes come, you have to have a system that's dynamic enough to respond to it. I think China's is responding to the dynamics of the world economy and the direction in terms of both society and politics, as opposed to the U.S., who, as I said, this nostalgia stands in the way of them confronting not only internal realities of a failing society and these massive debts that they have no talk right now about ever paying them back. I mean, that worries me because they're going to grow. By the end of this year, we'll be well over $40 trillion, and no one seems to be batting an eye except a few people on ideological lines who continue to vote for the very things that they say they're against. That's the politics of it. So, yeah, we're in a midst of a period of change, not only politically because of the U.S. and China, but also in terms of, the technology. I mean, the digital revolution is as great in my mind as the industrial revolution in terms of how it affects regular people. And there has to be new ideas, how to accommodate that, how to train people so they can be part of this new economy, uh, and how the economy is going to work. Do we have some new system where we employ people 3.5 days, a week, but you run a 7-day a week economy? You have 3 shifts, and it doesn't matter when you go to sleep or wake. Basically, all the services are available so that you're spreading out your economic activity. There's less and less is going to be necessary to provide the essentials of people's needs. I mean, food, assuming there's enough arable land, can be done with a fraction of the number of people it was done before. I mean, in China, you still have around a little over 30% of the people involved in agriculture. In the U.S., it's less than 2%. It's highly automated and things like that. But that opportunity is there. Then the labor doing that from that can be spread to elsewhere, but they have to be trained. You have to start thinking about what they can do and then showing them how to do it. Um, so there are areas, and there are many other areas where essential. I mean, building. If I print a building and I don't need masons and all of these types of things, what do we do with them? I think China is being very forward-looking. They don't talk a lot about it, but they've been investing more and diverting more people into areas where are going to be future opportunities. They're making sure that they have college graduates, but they're also overhauling the academic program so that these people are more in tune and have once they graduate, they do have good job prospects. So, government not only creating safety is responsible for preparing people to be productive parts of society, not interchangeable, but simply trying to match people and their interests and abilities to areas where they can have a fulfilling life. That's just as important. It's not just I have extra income, but it's like I go to work and I see value in what I do, and others see value, and that value transforms to me in terms of payment. So, governments who are able to adjust and provide for their people and their future, I think do very well. It's not about giving people stuff that's not productive. You're transferring wealth. If there's enough wealth to transfer, fine. And people in need, in some cases, all you can do is transfer. If they're quadriplegic and they can't work or they need extra assistance, yes, it's going to be a little bit of a drag on society, but you know, uh, you can't just abandon them. All right. Maybe
I
in
think
some
that's
societies it was.
no, I was gonna say I think that's a key challenge for all societies now moving forward. Creative destruction from the new economies emerging.